I'm Robert Grant, and this is the Codex. The Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most famous pieces of art. It's a fresco located in Milan, Italy, and has been the object of analysis by cryptographers for many, many centuries. As one of the most famous works of art in the world, and because it's attached to a wall, this painting cannot be sold. In fact, it's priceless. This painting seems to house so many encryptions in it that in fact it's become the subject of mainstream media and films for many years. Dan Brown's account in the Da Vinci Code is one example of this. Holy Blood, Holy Grail also points us in a similar direction, hidden encryptions inside the Last Supper painting. The first of these that everyone iconically remembers is that what we all believed was John the Apostle sitting to the right of Jesus was not in fact John the Apostle at all. In his very hermaphroditic sort of garb and look, John is actually the representation, many believe, to be Mary Magdalene. One of the things that we notice is that there is a void space between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, Jesus has clearly a symbol of what looks to be an upside-down triangle represented as the divine feminine. What I realized is that the inverted triangle of the Last Supper also carries the exact same angular reference of 51.843 degrees. Is this yet again pointing us to the Giza Plateau? What we find here also is other encryptions deeply hidden within this enigmatic painting. Another example that we can see here is that the face of Peter the Apostle, who strangely has his hand down the blouse of Mary Magdalene, and his right hand seems to be holding, in a contorted position, a knife. And who is it that's sitting in between Peter and Mary Magdalene? That's none other than Judas himself. In fact, you can see him holding his 30 pieces of silver in a small bag. Why would it appear as though Peter is seeming to conspire in some way, shape, or form with Mary Magdalene? And why is it that she's leaning in to listen to his whisper? What would they have to whisper about? And the face, there's something with the face of Peter also that seems to be drawing attention. Weren't all the apostles roughly the same age as Jesus? When Jesus was crucified, he was widely known to have been 33 years old. And yet we see the face of Peter as being a man probably in his late 40s or early 50s, having almost all gray, even white hair. But is there something else that we can notice about his face? Well, if we look at a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci from a similar period but later in his life, we'll notice that the face of Leonardo da Vinci himself in his own self-portrait matches the face of Peter, the apostle, who later became the head of the entire church. And is the knife that's being held behind his back a knife held by his hand? Or rather, is he holding the wrist of Mary Magdalene? These questions and more were the subject of our analysis. We also looked at the back wall, noticing that there were many other encryptions that somehow relate to other prominent places in none other than the King's Chamber itself.
Prior to visiting the Great Pyramid of Giza in 2018, Robert Grant intuitively sketched two particular Greek letters in his notebook, as if subconsciously making connections between the King's Chamber and the Last Supper that were yet to be discovered.
When I arrived in Egypt, I looked down while in the King's Chamber. I noticed the presence of what looked to be two letters, the Alpha and the Omega. So, an Alpha and Omega on the sarcophagus of the king's chamber? Isn't the pyramid famously devoid of any writing or hieroglyphics? And for thousands of years, hasn't this room been frequented by millions of people potentially? Let's not forget, this is the most studied building on the planet. It was the tallest building in the world for well over 4,000 years, and the King's Chamber is the most prominent of the chambers within the Great Pyramid. How is it even possible that this could not have been seen before? And is there anything that relates to the Last Supper that might point us in the same direction? You'll note that underneath the table, you can see the feet of several of the apostles. Some of them are wearing sandals. And you'll notice as well that if you try to look for the feet of Jesus, you will not be able to see the feet of Jesus because they're obstructed by what looks to be the upper doorway of some sort of portal in and out of the chapel where the Last Supper painting is housed. But what's also interesting about this is that when we notice the location of that portal, and if we believe art historians, they say that later in the 17th century, a doorway was cut into the wall of this very famous painting. This doesn't really seem to hold water for me, because Leonardo da Vinci was famous in his lifetime. In fact, this was a very famous fresco that the King of France himself made particular mention of in historical records. So why would the owners or the people that were taken care of as caretakers of this important place on hallowed ground have cut a doorway obstructing the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, potentially even then known as one of the greatest artists of all time?
If in fact the doorway was not cut into the fresco years later, but had always been there, as Robert Grant suggests, then the question arises, did Leonardo da Vinci integrate this door into his masterpiece? And if so, what is the significance of this possible encryption?
So when I started to notice that the other proportions of the room of the King's Chamber were relative to the Last Supper painting and vice versa, I started to think, are there other encryptions that might be hidden inside the walls of the Last Supper painting that are showing us and pointing us back to the King's Chamber itself?
What Robert Grant realized is that the placement of the Alpha and the Omega on the rim of the sarcophagus within the King's Chamber are proportionate to Jesus, the Alpha, and Mary Magdalene, the Omega, within the Last Supper.
And when we place an overlay, the exact position of the sarcophagus in its original position would occupy exactly the doorway that is obstructing the feet of both Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And we'll also notice that the proportions, when we place precisely the line of the ceiling against the back wall, which would reference what we refer to as the western wall of the Great Pyramid, is precisely pointing to the same proportional dimensions so that the entire table in perspective could be viewed as being part of the Last Supper scene. Is this telling us something more about the windows and portals and tapestries that are located within the Last Supper painting itself? Of course, we also notice that the location in the Last Supper painting of both Jesus and Mary Magdalene also conforms precisely to the golden number and golden cut, 1.618 verses 1. Interesting as well that, again, these proportions are matched in the Alpha Omega that I discovered on the rim of the sarcophagus, which is exactly 5.6 inches wide. The King's Chamber is 31.41596 meters. And the square root of that number, which is pi times 10, turns out to be 5.605 inches. 5.605 squared equals the dimension of the perimeter of the king's chamber room itself. Interestingly as well, the serif, or the peak of the letter A, is precisely at the 33rd inch of the 89.62 inch long sarcophagus. I and my colleagues note that is exactly 1 over the Euler number.
Euler's number is best known as the base for natural logarithms and is used in everything from explaining exponential growth, radioactive decay, and calculating compound interest.
This is a very important number, as fundamental as transcendental pi. In fact, if we take both of those numbers and we apply them together in the relationship of a tetrahedron nested within a sphere, we find that when we consider that a tetrahedron nested within a sphere would have a displacement of 1/3 of the volume of the sphere inside the tetrahedron, and 2/3 being outside of the tetrahedron nested within that sphere, and we apply those same proportions in a weighted average calculation, what we find is that pi times 2/3 plus Euler number, which is 2.718, times 1/3, added together in a weighted average calculation, gives us integer value 3.000. Both of these numbers seem to be boundary conditions for integer value 3. But why would we have the Euler number pointed to the alpha and omega on the rim of the sarcophagus? Advanced knowledge? Additionally, in the Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci left an area value of the square that didn't match the area value of the circle, which is pi, with a radius of 1. Instead, he left us an encrypted message for all to see, which is that the area, if we take the time to actually measure it, using the radius value of 1 of the circle, turns out to be precisely the Euler number 200 years prior to this purported discovery of the Euler number and its attributes, arguably the second most important mathematical constant to mathematicians, even of our day today. What was Leonardo trying to tell us? What else can we see inside the Last Supper painting? Let's look a little bit closer at the window behind Jesus. If we look closely at the pediment above Jesus, immediately above him and above the window behind him, we'll notice an eye. Not only is this orientation showing us and pointing to an eye, but we're also seeing that this is an ancient symbol used in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism as an all-seeing eye. But in Egyptian mythology and history, we know better. This eye is the eye of Ra, god of the sun.